Hey Amarillo, I'm Jason Boyette, and you're listening to Hey Amarillo, the interview podcast featuring some of the most interesting people and stories of Amarillo, Texas. This is episode 400. And a few people already know this, but for most of you, this will be a surprise. This is my final episode as the host of Hey Amarillo. I started this podcast in September of 2017. That's about 7.5 years ago. I'm 51, so that's like 1/7 of my life I've spent recording interviews with local people on a weekly basis, which, man, that seems like a really long time. Even though it feels like my first interview, which was with Ginger Nelson in her office at the old City Hall, it feels like that was just last week. But I'm done. So why am I ending my time on the show? I remember watching Seinfeld in the 1990s during the earliest years of my marriage. Amy and I watched it every Thursday night on this tiny little TV VCR combo we had back then before we had kids. It was in the 1900s. And Jerry Seinfeld decided to end his show in 1998 at the height of its popularity. NBC was willing to give him a ton of money to keep doing it, and he turned it down because his guiding principle as a comic was leave them wanting more. And back then he said he wanted the show to go out while people still liked it, and not when people were ready for it to end. And the point of me telling you that story is not to compare myself with Jerry Seinfeld, because if you know me and you know who he is, you would laugh at that. But I really resonate with that kind of thinking about going out on your own terms. And if you've been paying attention to me over the past year, you've probably heard me talk to guests about things like timing and stepping away from certain projects when the time was right. I've been thinking about this for a while. And this is about me. It's not about the project itself. I think it's time for new voices in this space that aren't my voice. People ask me all the time if I'm going to run out of people to interview, and I always tell them no. I mean, I could go out tomorrow and schedule a dozen interviews with fascinating local people. The quality of the people here, the stories tied to this area, it is just so deep. And so I still have names on my list of potential guests I made in 2017 before I started the show, and I haven't even gotten to some of those names. I could do these weekly interviews, I think, for a really long time, but I'm not going to. I have achieved what I wanted to achieve with Hey Amarillo, and I'm personally ready for a new chapter. And I want my time with the show to end while I'm still feeling creative and productive and before it starts to become a slog. Because as a listener, I think you'll be able to tell if I start treating it that way. I want to step away before the fire goes out. So after 400 weekly episodes, after 400 interviews, this is my last episode. I don't have a new guest today. I think wrapping up guest interviews with Holly Ridings last week felt pretty good to me. So instead of interviewing anybody today, I've asked a few former guests to send me questions. Sort of a self-indulgent Ask Me Anything episode. I'll answer those questions. My adult daughter, Ellie, is going to help me with that. But before we get to that part, I want to check in with Angelina Marie, who edits the show. She's done it since episode number 74 back in early 2019. She has been my first listener for every interview, and I wanted to talk to her about it. Here's Angelina. Angelina Marie, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Jason, it's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while since you've been on the show, although the show has been in your ears on a weekly basis.
Every Sunday.
So I'm grateful for that. Thank you for taking the burden of editing off my shoulders. I tell people that was the best decision I ever made with the podcast.
Yeah.
Was to stop doing that myself and to pay somebody to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a couple hours every week that you're a busy dude. You've got other things you should be doing in those couple hours.
Well,
so
it made sense. I should have done it sooner, but I hadn't found the right person, and then you ended up being the right person. So
yeah, I don't remember what number I came in on. I remember it was Patrick Burns.
It was Patrick Burns, and that was 2019. I feel like it was early-ish in 2019.
Yeah. It was February.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I just looked at it.
So that was about a year and a half into it, and I had edited all the episodes up until then.
Yeah.
And when I asked you to do it, we didn't know each other super well. We'd been hanging out a little bit, and I knew that you had some background in audio, and you knew the show. And so it was just kind of a hunch.
I had gotten my audio engineering degree in 2006.
Yes.
And had not used it since
long before
2009.
GarageBand or anything like that was a thing.
We did podcasts when we were in school, and no one knew what podcasts were. I thought it was the weirdest word, and now it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. Okay, so here's what I wanted to ask you now that we're concluding this weekly professional relationship where I send you audio files every week and you turn it into a finished product. I wanted to hear a little bit about your process. So what did the editing process look like for you? I mean, because people ask me all the time, like, how does that work? What does your editor do? Because they don't understand. I mean, they think there's this nice little music bed playing under me while I'm introducing it, and that
it's
kind of
not
thing.
Glamorous. It's not a highly technical podcast. It's pretty straightforward. I use GarageBand, which lets you know that there's not a whole lot of layers to it technically. So yeah, I get the files, put them in GarageBand. I cut out the ums, uhs, ticks, stutters, which everybody has,
including me,
including Jason. So I just did it.
Yeah,
obviously.
So you'll take that out though.
Well, we'll see. I might leave that one in for effect, but that's really it. And then I just send it back. It takes me probably 2 hours for almost an hour podcast.
Okay.
Some of them take a little longer if they have a lot of ticks that I have to remove. And I notice now when I'm listening to other podcasts, I can't. Like, I don't listen to podcasts as much as I used to because most people really don't edit that much.
Yeah.
They don't have time.
There was a real shift around 2020.
Yeah.
Where the cleanness and the pristineness of the audio changed. The carefulness people had with how it sounded changed. And so there's still some podcasts like The Daily that are intensely edited. And then others that sound like, some guy was recording it from his car with the window down.
The full conversation, every little bit. Yeah.
I feel like we were pretty good, middle ground between those.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we wanted to remove anything that was a distraction.
Yeah.
There's still a few little, ums here and there that slip through, but they're not distracting.
Well, and I think those are good because otherwise it would sound robotic. If it's too clean, then...
We did have one guest who's a friend of mine. After I edited, he listened and he was like, that doesn't sound like me.
Really?
Because I overdid it. So I think that was the only one that I was like, you know what? Okay, I did overdo it. I need to relax a little bit.
And I relaxed too over the years.
Yeah, we were
with what I wanted and required.
A lot more hardcore in the beginning.
Yeah. Which I was when I was editing myself
Yeah.
Before you came along. Some of our hardest ones have been guests that a lot of people don't talk in chronological order. Mm-hmm. And so some of the things they say might not make sense. Although in a conversation it kind of does, but like we tried to take some pieces and move them forward. And
as a listener, it might not make sense.
Yeah.
Where it does in conversation. And I think I was always surprised by who would be a really good speaker and who wouldn't. I mean, I'm not going to name names, obviously, because that's just mean. But, I would send you a text and be like, wow, that was a shocker. Like, that was a tough one. But we always made it work.
Some guests, I had you remove things for the protection of the guests or the podcast itself. Because a lot of people are fairly unfiltered in this setting. And I didn't feel super comfortable with some of that lack of filter.
Yeah, some people definitely wanted to say some things that we aren't comfortable sharing.
Yeah.
So.
Tell me what you're going to miss about doing this every week. Is there anything? Like, I know every job can become a grind. I know there are probably a lot of Sundays that you wish you didn't have a podcast to edit. Is there anything you'll miss from it?
I will say that doing it on Sunday is my fault. Jason would send it to me, Wednesday, Thursday, sometimes Friday. I had time to do it, but it was always like, it's Sunday, I got to do this. I think really it's more of the getting to meet people. Even if I don't actually meet them in person, I got to kind of meet them through the podcast. And if I see them out in public, I can approach them and be like, hey, I edited your episode. And every single time they would apologize and say, I'm so sorry, it must have been awful. And they're not 99.9% of the time. So I think I'll miss that, getting to know people in Amarillo that I may not have otherwise been around or even, out in public recognized. So that was
There's
cool.
there's an intimacy in listening to a podcast just in general because somebody's voice is in your ears, and that's different from even hanging around them in person. I feel like, and then you took that to a different level, and that their voice was in your ear as you edited, and so you were paying very particular attention to the voice.
I was and I wasn't. I had my brain kind of rewired as I did this more and more, where I would listen more for what I needed to edit out. So if
then the actual content, it became sort of mechanical.
Yeah, because I could actually do the podcast and edit photos at the same time. So I'm doing both of my jobs on 2 different laptops, and I could hear what I would need to take out.
That's really interesting.
So sometimes I would kind of miss the podcast, and I get through the whole episode and be like, what just happened?
And it was edited, but none of the words
catch
landed.
Anything. Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah.
We talked about the process. I should probably say that I would send you the files. You would do an edit. I would get them on Sunday, and I would listen to the whole thing again. Usually while I was doing something else, just listening to it as a person would listen to a podcast and waiting for something to stop me, because that would be something I would want you to edit out.
And it was usually a stutter or something that didn't quite make
sense. Or
a
cough or something like that. Or if I had something in mind and I thought, oh, that's one thing I need to tell Angelina to take out, and then I forgot to tell you, I would go back and do that. Because some of those things are not things that you would have known. It was like content stuff from my side. Some of the questions I got from guests in this episode, which I'll get to later, are if any episodes changed my mind about anything. I want to know, like, if you had the same experience. Like, was there a guest or a perspective or an issue or something that came up that made you see it in a different light, even if you aren't a typical listener?
I could probably spend a couple episodes talking about Hey Amarillo's greatest hits, but I narrowed it down to just 2. So one that really sticks with me is Laura Street's episode. So she talks about founder syndrome, which I'd actually never heard of before. And that's basically where you begin to make decisions based on your personal desires, or you let ego get in the way instead of really addressing what you're doing for the community and discussing with your board what really needs to be done. And as someone who's a co-founder of a nonprofit who's just trying to get it off the ground, this is something that I check myself on daily. So I actually hear her voice in my head very often saying, step back, make sure you're doing this for the right reasons, and get your ego out of the way.
Okay.
So I really appreciate
That's
that.
Good, yeah.
And I don't think I've actually ever met her. But if I ever see her, I will approach her and let her know. So
the two of you definitely need to talk.
Yeah. She seems like she's got a lot of wisdom to share.
Yeah.
And then the other one would be Rachel Edwards, the late, great artist. We lost her in 2020, I believe. Yeah.
She was on the show in 2019. It was one of your... Did you edit her
I think
episode?
so, yeah. I think that was one of the earlier ones. She was wonderful. I didn't know her very well, but we had, met a few times, and she was always very kind. But of course, she talked about a lot of art in her episode, and as an artist, I really appreciate that. And at one point, she addresses, what do you consider art? And she answers that by saying the core of it is humans relating to humans, whether it's 200 years ago or 5 seconds ago. It's a connection, and you still connect to work from decades ago because that artist put that human emotion into it. So it translates through generations. And I just thought that was really, really beautiful. And she also went on to say, it can fill you with kind of a sense of you're not alone. And as artists, we often have this kind of isolationist issue. But through art, we can feel less alone and feel like we have a purpose. And even if that purpose is to translate grief and sorrow, we find a way to do that through art. And I really, really appreciate what she said about that.
I need to go back and listen to her
it's a
episode.
Good episode. It is. I would love for somebody, and I might actually try and make this happen, but to put together a memorial for her, because we never had one, because it was in 2020. And I think a lot of people didn't really get to grieve her together as a group.
Yeah, I did a retrospective episode where I invited several of her friends to talk on the show for that very reason. Like, because that was during a stage of COVID, like
one.
We
that
weren't
was
having
early.
funerals. Like
Yeah.
people just weren't together.
Yeah.
I need to go listen to that one again too.
Everyone should. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have, beyond those that were meaningful to you,
Mm-hmm.
do you have a favorite episode?
Yes. In June of 2020, when the Black Lives Matter movement was going on, we did the episode Value My Life, in quotations, discussing race and justice. And that's just such a different format from anything else we did.
Yeah.
And I think it was one of the most important episodes, for sure.
I think you're right. That was a hard one. I mean, that was hard for me. Usually these interviews are easy for me. That one was not. And it felt like I was tiptoeing the whole time to ask the right questions and also to honor the guests' perspectives, because I felt like that one I needed to disappear.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I try not to make any of them about me. Like, I try to talk very little or as little as possible. I fail at that. But like, that was one where I just thought I need to be invisible in this one.
Yeah, it's their platform.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you had some really great guests on that one. Bowden Jones Jr., Jasmine Taylor, Joseph Peterson, Leah Warren, David Lovejoy, who I adore, and Patrick Miller, who I also adore. And they all had very similar things to say, but each of them had such a strong personality and message to get across. And I think that was a really good chance for them to do that.
Yeah.
In a town that might not hear their voice very often.
Yeah. I'm glad that digital record is in place. Okay. This is something that my guests and I talk about all the time. And you've answered it, I'm sure, because you did an 8 Straight episode once, long, long ago.
Yeah.
I think it's the first time I met you.
I don't remember that very well.
Yeah. But what, like, we talk about Amarillo all the time. So I know you think about it. What would you like to see change or improve about our city as it is right now?
I want to start on a positive note by saying that I am seeing a lot of things that years ago I really wanted to see, which would be activism, organization, and community. And that kind of goes across all age groups, which I think is really impressive for Amarillo. But that being said, I would like to see more value for our skilled and talented workers, whether it be creative or, something not artistic. I think we lose a lot of people because they don't feel valued. They don't feel like they're going to get paid enough. They may not have that education that they need here, which I know is changing. I see the shift, but I also still see a lot of hesitancy of Amarillo changing. But Amarillo is going to change. There's nothing we can do about it. It's going to continue to grow. And if we don't value these skilled workers, we're going to lose them. And what's going to happen is, as we grow and we continue to be this affordable little city, other people are going to come in and see that they can come here cheaply and they can get started from the ground up. And instead of giving that opportunity to people that grew up here, we're going to give it to outsiders, which I'm fine with. But I know the word outsiders really scares a lot of Amarilloans. So if you really want your people to stay here, pay them what they're worth.
Yeah, I agree.
Simple as that. I mean, as a creative, pay them what they're worth.
I appreciate that. I appreciate your involvement. Thank you for being part of this project for 5.5 of its 7+ years.
Wow, that went by fast.
Yeah. Ellie Boyette, welcome to the Hey Amarillo podcast. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being the host today. So I want to let you introduce yourself to listeners. So tell us who you are.
So my name is Ellie Boyette. I am Jason's daughter. I am his oldest daughter. And this is my first time on his podcast and my first time doing a podcast in general. So this is all brand new territory for me.
Okay. Well, you're like many guests who told me this is the first podcast I've ever been on. So that's good. So you are going to be the host today. We have been collecting questions from former guests. I told them they could ask me anything. It could be about the podcast. It could be about Amarillo. It could be about my personal life. And so you've got those questions. And I'm going to let you ask them as the host, and I'll try to answer them. And if you have a follow-up question or something like that, you can ask that too. So that's up to you.
Perfect.
So go for it.
All right. This first one is from Tony Inzer, who was a 2-time guest, most recently in January of 2025, and then in June of 2018 during the Sod Poodles name controversy. When you decided to do the podcast 400 episodes ago, you had other options of things to do. What were they, and are you happy with the decision that you made?
I like that one. That's from Tony, who's the GM of the Sod Poodles. The first time I interviewed him that was the biggest listenership I had up to that point, because it was such a big local controversy. I like this question because it's about opportunity cost, which is the idea that if you choose one path, you're also choosing not to pursue other paths. You're giving up potentially a lot of things in order to do one thing. And I think about that a lot in my work. And so I started this podcast a year after I just published my 12 Major World Religions book. So that was in 2016. I started this podcast in 2017. And at that point, I had written a bunch of books, and that one was really hard. And I remember thinking that was way too much of a lift. I don't want to do that again for a while. And so I don't really think of starting the podcast as it took away from the ability to write other books, or it forced me down one path and not another path, because it actually opened up opportunities for me to do things that I wasn't expecting. So I was able to have regular appearances on Studio 4 on KMR to talk about the show. That was new for me. I was able to do events like the Hey Amarillo Beer Fest, hosted that for 3 years. Brick and Nail Magazine, I think, grew out of some of the community trust that I built from doing the podcast. And so you can look at it as, well, this kept me from doing other things, but you can also look at it as, oh, here are some things I otherwise would not have been able to do had I not started this. And so that's kind of how I like to look at it. There's a book called 4,000 Weeks. I've told you about this book, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. And it's been really psychologically impactful for me in the way that I approach work and life. And one of the things that it hammers home is that we're guaranteed to miss out on like almost every experience the world has. You just can't do everything. Exactly. You can do a couple of things. Mm-hmm. And when you think about it that way, like the fact that one choice makes you miss out on infinity choices it kind of frees you up not to worry about what you're missing. It doesn't feel like a problem to do that. And so, I don't know, it helped me enjoy the things that I do choose to do. And this was one of them. So, I don't feel like I missed out on much of anything.
Yeah.
If nothing else, I gained stuff from doing it.
Yeah, it's all about perspective.
Yeah.
So this next question is related to the previous one from Tony Inser, because the first time you had him on was because you didn't like the options for the minor league baseball team name. It's from Jason Herrick, who was on the show in October of 2020. Do you regret going all in on the anti-Sod Poodle team name, or maybe asked another way, what are your takeaways from the journey of excitement about the stadium/ball team to staunch opposition to the naming to the eventual rollout and now reflecting back on it?
Okay, so you can hear me wrestling with the context of this question, I think, in my second interview with Tony, which was this year, because we touched on some of that, because we talked about that moment 5 years ago. And I would push back a little bit on Jason's characterization of me as like staunch opposition to the naming or going all in on being anti-Sod Poodles. I don't feel like I was quite as angry as other people were about it. I definitely had some friends that like had press conferences about it, and were really, really pushing back. I didn't like the name Sod Poodles and the other 4 choices because I didn't think they were accurate reflections on who Amarillo really was. They made us seem kind of like country bumpkins that minimized who we were. And so I feel like that's what I was pushing back on, that it didn't reflect us in a positive light. What I have come to realize, and maybe that's staunch opposition or not, I'd have to listen to that interview with Tony. I did push back against it some. I think a lot of it was I just don't know that world of minor league baseball. And I didn't know Tony well enough to trust him because he was new in the area.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know the management group, but I knew Amarillo and I wanted it to be good and I wanted it to be successful. And so I feel like I was pushing back against something I didn't fully understand. Because as we've all seen, like Sod Poodles ended up being a great name. It's gained national acclaim. It's won awards. People who don't live in Amarillo are wearing Sod Poodles gear. Tony understood that world, and I did not. And I think that was the nature of the conflict. And I think it all comes down to like, we didn't know him and we didn't trust him. And that was true for me. And so regret, no, I don't regret it. I feel like I was doing a small amount of service for the community and pushing back. I still have people who are like, I'm so glad you did that episode. Even now, like they still remember that because I was kind of representing some of the feelings here.
Mm-hmm.
And so, no, there's no regret about it. But when I reflect back, I'm happy that we had that conversation. I'm happy I got to know Tony. I'm happy the Sod Poodles are here. I'm happy they're named the Sod Poodles, and I'm happy they're successful. And so to have a tiny, tiny little part in the rollout of that name was kind of cool. And it was early in the podcast, and I was like, oh man, I have to do these kinds of things. I remember that interview. I felt really uncomfortable because I'm not like a confrontational journalist at all.
Yes.
So I was nervous about that one, but it was fun, and I'm happy where we've ended up. So.
Yeah. Do you think that naturally taking the opposite stance of Tony helped kind of nurture or like begin that relationship that you have with him and be able to have that going forward? Like that was kind of the key point in starting that?
I mean, maybe so. Because when we started Brick and Elm, like Tony knew me from that. And the Sod Poodles became an advertiser for us. Like we've had an advertising partnership with them. And so like every relationship you build, even if it's like a hard relationship, I think there's some currency to it and there's some give and take, and all of that builds trust with each other. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that was our introduction. It was that phone call. It was a weird introduction, but like he remembers it and I remember it. And we talk about it when we see each other from time to time.
Yeah. All right. This next question is from Jim Witten, who was a guest on the show in December of 2021. How have you changed as a result of doing these 400 episodes?
Yeah, Jim is one of those guests. I'm grateful for him because we became pretty good friends after he was on the show. Like that's the first time we met. But he's been a friend of mine since then. He's been a financial supporter, so I appreciate that. I have changed, I think, in a couple of ways. Just from a mechanical standpoint, like I'm a much better interviewer now than I was. I mean, you get 400 plus hours of practice doing a thing, You're going to get better at it. I'm a better listener. A lot of times in a conversation with people, we don't really listen to each other. We just think about what we're going to say next. And you can't do that in this setting. Mm-hmm. Like I have to know what I'm going to say next, but what you say is going to guide that. And I have to be able to drive a conversation forward while still reacting to what my guest says. And so that has made me, I think, a better listener just in real life. But I think more than anything else, what's changed is that this has put me in a position where I need to be more aware of what's happening in Amarillo, because that helps me invite the right guests on and ask the right questions and be knowledgeable enough to respond to the things they say. And so as a result, I've become a lot more invested in the city. Mm-hmm. I mean, you'll know this, like before I started the podcast, I was not serving on community boards or city boards or going to events and stuff like that. So now I'm much more connected to this place. I pay much closer attention to the news and to communities and nonprofits and events and what's happening at City Hall and all that kind of stuff. And that's definitely a change, and I think it's a good change.
Absolutely. I think I agree with you on that. This next question is from Patrick Burns, who was a guest on the show in February of 2019. With your background, what role do you think the religious dogma of our area is doing to better or hold our community back?
Yeah, I'm laughing at this one because this is exactly the kind of question Patrick would ask to get me in trouble or start fun conversations. He's a good friend, and he's been a financial supporter. I appreciate that. He's talking about my background as a writer about religion, and I'll talk about this later, but like one new project I've started over the past few months is a Substack newsletter about religion that's kind of going back to my roots as a writer. And I think religion in Amarillo, and I think that's a specific reference to the dominant evangelical Christian presence here. I think it plays a complicated role in our community. On one hand, on the plus side, the churches and the faith-based nonprofits and organizations here provide an incredible network of support. Like, they are doing good work. They're a lot of times they're the first to show up when people are in crisis, when the food bank needs volunteers. They're providing addiction recovery. They're helping families in need. They're involved with refugees and immigrants. They're teaching English. Like, all those things, that kind of compassion and generosity is a real strength of the community, and it's a strength of the church, and I respect that. I think on the negative side, where it can become a challenge, and maybe, well, what did Patrick say? What were his words? Hold our community back?
Yes.
I think it's when your religious beliefs become dogma and become fences that separate you. When they cross over from like your personal faith into like a rule that everyone is expected to follow, that's when it becomes divisive. And I think sometimes that division can hold us back. It can make it harder for us to have open conversations about things like diversity, like science or mental health. I mean, I grew up thinking mental health as traditionally provided was a bad thing, that you shouldn't pursue, therapy unless it was within these very tight, structures. Even like, I don't know, economic innovation or stuff like that. Like if those topics are seen as conflicting with your very narrow interpretation of faith, then sometimes like you don't want to be a part of it and you don't want it to happen. And it feels like there's sometimes, because of that, there's not much room for people who think differently than we do or who don't fit a certain mold. And I mean, we've been feeling that lately in the city because churches have started to get more involved in city government. And I think that's good. I think the church should be working to improve the community. But when that dogma is informing all of that, that's when it can get really tricky. I mean, we saw that with the Sanctuary City controversy, because that was people of faith who I think had really good intentions, probably wanting to impose their perspectives on the city. And even with good intentions, that can be divisive. So if we want Amarillo to grow and thrive, if we want to attract new talent, if we want people from outside who are not like us, who can bring ideas that we would not otherwise have had, like, they have to be comfortable here. And if they are not people of faith and we make them uncomfortable, then our faith is getting in the way of that. So we have to create a space where everybody feels like they belong, regardless of what they believe. And that's really hard. And I know that's hard because that's the world I grew up in. It can hold us back.
This next question is from Bowden Jones Jr., who was on the show in August of 2020. I am sure people come up to you all the time telling you about this story or this guest or that guest. Tell us about the interview that you felt had the greatest impact, not only on your listeners, but on you as well, and why.
I really appreciate this question from Bowden, because one of my goals with the show has been to expose listeners to conversations they would not otherwise have had. And there are a couple of episodes that I still hear about from people who say that happened for them. Like, they recognize that, and because of that, it kind of changed their perspective because of the guest. One of those was Julio Salazar. And Julio was in 2018. It was early 2018. It was really early in the show. And this was during the first Trump administration. And the news cycle during that time, you probably didn't pay attention because you were graduating from high school at that time. But the news cycle was dominated by the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals controversy, DACA. And the U.S. government went through a whole shutdown related to a budget stalemate involving DACA. The administration wanted to do away with it, and it was placing the future of people like Julio in jeopardy. And so Julio was a college student at the time, and he'd grown up in Amarillo because his parents came here. They brought him here as a child, and they overstayed their visa. And so they were here illegally, and he was allowed to stay here because of childhood arrivals, because of DACA. But if they pulled that away, he would have had to go back to Mexico. And he only knew Amarillo. And so he was facing the potential of deportation. And I think for a lot of people, it helped listeners put like a human face, a local person, on this big political decision-making that was happening in Washington that we didn't have any control over. I've had listeners tell me it shaped their views on immigration. And that makes me feel good.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really easy to demonize people when they are a group that we don't know, and we can call them illegals or whatever. But then you have to say, we need to deport Julio. And Julio is somebody we know. And that makes it a lot more personal and a lot more difficult to demonize a person like that. So that's one of them. Another one that, and this might be surprising to people, but this is a conversation that Amy, your mom, and I have had a lot. And it was the Dean Boyd episode. Because when I interviewed Dean, like I knew him, I'd done a story about him in the media. And everybody just knew Dean Boyd as like this cartoonish figure on TV. You know, he has the commercials, and sometimes they're silly, or sometimes, they're overly dramatic. And he's a personal injury lawyer. And we joke about those kinds of lawyers and attorneys. I mean, Better Call Saul, like that's what that whole show's about. And I had a sense from having talked to him that like Dean was a whole lot deeper than that. And I think when you only know somebody because of billboards, and then you listen to them talk about themselves for 45 minutes and why they got into law and why they help people who have been injured, why they're protecting lower income people from these big corporations that want to take advantage of them, like people saw a different side of Dean Boyd. And I still hear from guests who are like, man, I used to laugh at that guy, and now I really respect what he does after they listen to that episode. So that's another one of those stories that it takes somebody that you might have a caricature of, and it humanizes them. And I mean, to be perfectly frank, like we ended up becoming clients of Dean Boyd when Owen had his accident. Yep. Like we called Dean the next day, and I said, I know this is what you do. We need your services. We were very happy customers. And so that's one of those episodes that I'm pretty proud of, because it did change the way listeners looked at somebody in the community.
For the second part of Bowden's question, what one do you think had the greatest impact on you personally?
I have several.
I know it's hard to choose from.
I know it is hard to choose from. And some of them were personal enough that I'm a little bit hesitant to talk about those in public. One of the things that I really liked was talking to people whose experiences were very different from mine. And I made a point to interview some people like that. Some people who had just gotten out of jail, one guest, a number of guests who had a different sexual orientation, guests who had different politics from me, guests who came out of poverty. All of those, I feel like, improve me as a person because it makes me more empathetic to people. Because when you know people's stories, you know them at a different level than what you just think you know by looking at them or by putting them in some sort of a category. There's a person who's in a gay marriage. I can't relate to him. But then I interview somebody like Neil Nossaman, who talks about, his love for Greg and how the relationship developed, and then when they could finally get married. And it's a love story that's the same as my story with Amy. And so it helps you to empathize with people. And so there are a ton of those where I saw myself in their stories, even though their stories were very different from my story. And so I think every guest probably changes me in some way. And I think if it didn't, this podcast wouldn't be super good.
Exactly.
Why do it,
Yeah, completely understandable. This next question is from Gwen Hicks, who you interviewed in January 2023. If you synthesized all interviews, what 3 or more things would be the overarching takeaways about the people of the Amarillo area?
Okay, so let me synthesize everything real quick. No, that's actually not a hard one. I think one of the things I really hear all the time, and I think frequent listeners will pick up all these threads, is that the people of Amarillo and Canyon really love and appreciate the people of Amarillo and Canyon. Mm-hmm. Like when I ask people what they love about living here or why it's underrated, we always end up talking about the people. And I think the friendliness and generosity of local residents is something we take for granted, but it's also something a lot of people really do recognize. And it's different from other places we've been. Another thing is I've had a lot of discussions with people who grew up here and then they moved away and they lived somewhere else. And then they felt themselves drawn back home. And that could be for a variety of reasons, but economically, those are known as boomerang residents. I wrote an article about it for Brick and Elm at one point. From an economic perspective, cities love boomerang residents because they're really, really valuable. They go into other cities and other cultures and they see what that culture has, and then they come back and they say, we need that in Amarillo. And so they drive change, they drive innovation. I think that's valuable, of course, but like it's helped me see that there's also a gravity to Amarillo, and that gravity is sometimes hard to escape. And gravity can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. Mm-hmm. If you're overweight and your knees are giving out and you can't move very well, like gravity is the reason for some of those aspects of not being healthy. But gravity is also why we have the moon, and it's why we don't fly off into space when the world spins around. So that's a good thing. So I think there's value in escaping that gravity because you want to experience the larger world beyond the Texas Panhandle if you have the privilege to do that. But for other people, like that gravity is good because once you escape orbit and you go someplace else, then you realize what you took for granted back home. And a lot of people have discovered that. So that's 2 things. The third takeaway is that, and this is a really, maybe something only I would see, but it is really rare for people to get an opportunity to sit like you are across a small table from somebody who is making eye contact with them and talk about themselves for 45 minutes. Nobody ever does that. And it's really, really intimate. It can make some people uncomfortable. And I think that's why a lot of people cry during these interviews. And they're like, I didn't think I was going to cry, but like, I don't know, somebody's looking at you and you're telling your story, like that happens. And it feels like therapy for some people. And I think it's been an opportunity for these guests to reflect about why they live here in a way that I don't think they otherwise do. Like they have to reckon with that decision and with why it was good or why it was bad or what they learned from it. And we don't always do that without being prompted. Yeah. And the people who live here are here on purpose, and it's meaningful for them to figure out what that purpose is. And I think some of my guests had to confront that while being in this interview setting. Those are three takeaways.
Great. This next question is one I find super interesting. It is from Courtney White, who was a guest in July of 2022. Who, in your opinion, had the best voice?
I had to talk this over with Amy because she's listened to every episode. And I think we had different opinions about it. Because I don't know what constitutes the best voice. I mean, I had some guests who were literally paid for their voice. Like they were professional radio people or professional audiobook narrators and things like that. So those people obviously had good voices. But I remember Dr. Carolina Perez had a really cool voice. She was from Colombia, grew up in Colombia. And so she had a really cool accent. Tom Martin was a more recent guest who had a really great, grandfatherly, out on the farm sort of voice. Larry Borger has a voice like that. I love Alani Diocumbayo's accent because he had that really great, grew up in Africa and moved here when he was 7. And so his English is super good, but he's got a really rich accent. And that's super cool. Marcus Sneed, who was 2 episodes ago, has such an interesting voice. It's completely identifiable if you ever hear it.
Yes.
Another one, and this might be a surprise, but like Lindsay London Baker was on the show just 2 or 3 months ago, and she has a slow and really soothing voice, really easy to edit, but like really easy to listen to too. So I have like so many answers to that question.
Yes.
Probably doesn't say anything and that I can't identify the best voice.
I think that all voices have their own unique qualities to it, and it just, whatever really captivates your attention, I think that is a good way to constitute what a best voice is. And I think all of those guests that you named accurately fit that description.
Good. One thing guests tell me is like, I don't know if I can listen to this because I can't listen to my own voice. Like some guests, I'm sure, have never listened to their episode. But like, that used to be a thing with me, and it is not a thing anymore.
You worked through it?
Yeah. I just, whatever that block is that people have, because it sounds different, I don't hear it at all anymore.
Interesting.
Because I've had to listen to my voice 400 times. And so it sounds like me in the podcast recording. So like that's a thing that can go away if you expose yourself to it so much.
I'll have to keep that in mind.
Exposure therapy.
I said that exact same thing before you asked me to do this. Who wants to listen to their own voice? Yeah, this next question is from Ryan Pennington, who was on the show in August of 2018. What is one large-scale project that you believe would create a particularly significant impact here, based on all the areas of need or excitement or investment you've heard about over the years? And then following up on that, what is a project idea that excites you?
The same answer to both questions, and it's not anything surprising to anybody. It's a new civic center. I think one of the biggest failures Amarillo has had over the past 7 years, or at least since I started this podcast, was our inability to get public support and funding for a new civic center. Part of that was the timing of it, because the first attempt was in 2016, and that proposal to get funding didn't pass. And so then they tried it again in November of 2020, which was a presidential election, which was in the middle of COVID.
Yeah.
It was a really divisive year culturally and politically, and it didn't pass because it was a divisive issue. And there were other business leaders that introduced their own plans. And so we missed that window. And then the council came up with other funding methods, and that generated controversy to try to do it like a couple years later. And there were legal challenges, and there was all this political turmoil. And as a result of all that, like, we have done nothing. Nothing has happened. Even the competing plans, nothing has happened. Yeah. And so we have the same tired and broken civic center that we had 8 years ago in 2016.
Yeah.
And everything's more expensive now were we to build. I think we missed the bus on it.
Missed the opportunity.
Yeah, like that window might be closed. And I think the failure of our city's leadership to come up with some sort of solution, and it's not just a failure of leadership, it's the failure of the residents to have the vision for it too. Whether we get a new one, whether we get a renovated one, like, it's a generational failure. Yeah. Like, it's going to have economic impact on the city for the next decade or two. And we still need to do it. Like, but it's got so much baggage now and so much political controversy attached to it. Like, I don't know if we're going to do it.
Yeah.
We missed the bus.
Yeah. While I hope that's not the case, I kind of agree. I feel like that window might be quickly closing.
I mean, we could do it. It's going to cost like 3 times what it would have cost in 2020, 2021.
This is from Joseph Peterson, who was on the show in January of 2024. What was confirmed about Amarillo in making the podcast?
I don't know if this is what Joseph meant. He might have been thinking more along the lines of like the overarching themes and stuff from Gwen's question, but I'm going to answer what it confirmed for me. And it was the idea I had at the start to start the podcast, that Amarillo people would be interested in a very locally focused interview show with people who live here. I thought of it as an experiment when I launched it. And I thought, let's see if this works, if people will listen to it, and people listen to it immediately. And so as long as I could be consistent with the style and the schedule and the formats, like, people listened to it and made it a part of their podcast routine or their media consumption routine or whatever, And it was really just a few weeks from the launch when advertisers started to approach me and listeners started to suggest people to interview. And people started suggesting themselves as interviewees or potential guests. And so the idea that it would work was confirmed really, really quickly. And it also confirmed to me, like, just the overall concept of the show, that there are much more interesting people who live here than people know about. People who had interesting stories to tell. And I think most of us just don't realize that because we don't encounter them in the world. And so what I was doing was encountering them and then creating a platform to introduce them to people.
Did that surprise you how quickly it kind of gained traction?
The speed was surprising. Okay. Yeah. I thought I might have to like grind away for 2 or 3 months. And it was just within a couple of weeks. I think everybody got it. And everybody was like, oh, this is cool. And yes, it was a lot faster than I thought. And then I was like, well, I guess I'm doing a podcast now.
This next question is from Carolee Clay, who was a guest earlier this year in January of 2025. Which interview or moment made you laugh the hardest and why?
Okay, so you know me. I'm pretty emotionally reserved, especially in this setting.
Yeah.
In a professional setting during the show. So I think there are very few, I haven't gone back and listened to everything, of course, but there are very few places where you're going to hear me like really and truly laugh during an interview. I'm sure the ones where I did were probably my interviews with my sister Micah and my brother Brooks, because we laugh a lot when we're together, and I'm going to be a little less buttoned up in that situation. So I'm sure we laughed then. There were a couple of moments I really remember, and I'm not going to name names on these, but one guest was really nervous before his interview, and this was like a 4:30 interview at the end of the day, and he asked me if we could do a shot of vodka together before the interview started, like direct words. Do you have any vodka? Could we do a shot? And I was like, well, okay. It helped him relax, and I want my guests to be relaxed.
Yeah.
I was already relaxed. I mean, it was long after I stopped being nervous for interviews before they started. So we did it after having done a shot right before it. I don't think you can tell. I think listeners have no idea who that is.
That's the first I've heard of that story. So that's really funny.
That was really funny. Another guest had her phone set so that Siri announced the caller in a male voice when the phone rang. And I forgot to ask her to silence the phone before the interview started. And so right in the middle of our recording, while she was talking, her phone started ringing, making like a little song. And then Siri started announcing a name in this male voice. And she just talked right over it like nothing had happened. And I was like, well, got to take out whatever she said just then. Angelina had to edit that out. And after that point, I started asking all my guests to silence their phones before the interview. I did not expect that. A couple of guests over the years, and I absolutely will not name names on this, were, let's say politely, were very preoccupied with their own accomplishments, as I think all of us are, and as I am, but I have a filter. And most people have a filter, whether it's false humility or real humility. And listening to a couple of these interviews, they did not realize how they were coming off. And I thought in those instances about editing out some of their most grandiose sort of statements, because I try to protect my guests, especially well-meaning guests. I want to keep them from saying something in public that they might regret, that might reflect poorly on the show. But I didn't always do that in those cases. And I think listeners recognized when that was happening. Occasionally people said something to me like, well, you just let them keep talking. And I learned a lot about that person, and it wasn't really a positive thing for some of them. So that's not ha-ha funny, but it is
something unexpected.
It is unexpected. And it is odd when you find somebody who just doesn't have that sort of filter, doesn't know how they come off in public. And that probably applies to me too. In this setting, but those are very memorable moments. Those are the stories I tell when people ask me about what's something weird that happened during the podcast.
Here's another one from Gwen Hicks. What was the most surprising thing you learned about yourself during the tenure of Hey Amarillo?
I'll repeat what I mentioned earlier, the part about I wasn't super engaged in the community before I started the show. My work was largely outside Amarillo. I had a lot of professional writing clients who were not in Amarillo. Some were not in Texas. And so I didn't feel really engaged with the city. And by doing this podcast, I learned that you can have a lot of influence locally when you pay attention and when you get involved at a local level. And so we've seen in the past few months how national politics can be, let's say, really frustrating, when you have leaders that are making decisions that we don't have any control over, and yet they impact our community, they impact people we know, they impact us personally. Like, that's demoralizing. But when you stop looking at things nationally and when you think about locally, you can have a lot of influence. And so the national politics can feel really overwhelming, impossible to have any reach there. But like in your neighborhood or your school board or city council or a nonprofit, like your voice and your presence can actually shift the outcomes in ways that are beneficial to you and your neighbors. And so like, I haven't run for any office, and I don't think I will ever run for office. But the access that I've had from having a podcast or a magazine like Brick and Elm has shown me that it's possible to be part of decisions that shape my neighbors' lives. Mm-hmm. I just didn't grow up with that kind of example. And I learned it too late, like in my 40s. Well, not too late, but I learned it in my 40s. Like, that's pretty late. And so one of the things I really learned about myself was that it's possible to be culturally engaged and to have influence. And when I realized that, I realized how much I'd been missing out on in Amarillo. And so that's one thing I talk to people a lot about outside the show, is that how important it is to get involved, to volunteer, to serve on a board, to volunteer for a nonprofit, to go to local meetings or speak up at forums. I mean, your comment on Facebook about something is not going to change anything.
Yeah.
Might make you feel good, but you really can change things if you commit to the place where you live and you get involved. I mean, that's a really important thing, I think, for adults to learn, for kids to learn, anybody to learn.
Mm-hmm. This one is from Ginger Nelson, and it's a two-parter. She was on the show twice. First in September of 2017 for the very first episode of Hey Amarillo.
Yeah, very first guest.
Very first.
I was nervous for that one.
And then again in the 300th episode, live show in May of 2023. What impact do you think Hey Amarillo has made in our community? And what role do you think podcasts have in journalism and in culture shaping?
The first question, what impact has Hey Amarillo made? I don't think I can answer that. I don't think I should answer that. Mm-hmm. I think that's a question for other people to answer. I can tell you what impact I hope it's made. And what I hope for it is that it has helped people recognize a couple of different things about the city. I hope it has helped people recognize that Amarillo is a lot more diverse than we think. I tried to bring in guests that might challenge your perspectives. I tried to expose listeners to conversations they would not otherwise have had. And I also think there's still a mindset of negativity here. People tend to apologize for Amarillo, or they feel like they have to justify why they live here, or explain to visitors why it's so windy that we hate it too, or complain about things. Like, there's a lot of complaining that happens here. And I wanted to challenge that too, because there are people doing really cool, interesting things in Amarillo. There's a reason we decided to stay here and raise you guys here, raise our family here. And so I wanted people to listen to an episode with a guest like Melanie Korpstein or Donovan Blair, who's a bassist for the Toadies, or Dr. Norbert Chirazi, like people who are very interesting and choose to live here. And I wanted my listeners to say, wow, I had no idea somebody like that lived in Amarillo. I hope it had that impact. Whether I was successful, that's not for me to say. The second part about journalism and culture shaping, I guess the first answer was kind of a culture shaping answer, but the second part of the question, like, I'm a journalist, and I always thought of Hey Amarillo as being more aligned with journalism than with entertainment, because it was an interview with people. And I think in the journalism world, like, podcasting is definitely a tool that's reshaping how stories get told and how audiences engage with news. deep dive storytelling, like that's a really good example. Podcasts like Serial or like Tom Brown's Body that take a story and dig into it for 7 or 8 episodes. I really love those. And I really love that format. And that's just a brand new format. And I like podcasts like The Daily that the New York Times puts out, where it addresses the news of the day by bringing in the journalists who are writing about it and having them explain it. So you can read their article and then you can listen to them explain the experience of writing that article and what they gained from it and that sort of thing. Like that gives background to the face of reporting. And so I really like that kind of, that personalizing the process of journalism, because you hear real voices and real people, and it's an intimate format. And that kind of intimacy, I think, builds trust. And this is a moment where there's a lot of skepticism about the media. Journalism can be divisive. We don't trust the news. And podcasting as a format increases trust. And I think that's a positive step. Yeah. I definitely think that the trust I built with listeners on Hey Amarillo helped me launch Brick and Elm a few years ago, because they knew I was coming from the right place. And they thought, well, if this project was successful, then I'll give them a shot with this other project, because they understood that I was committed to telling people stories about this area. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it did. And that was actually, you answered something I was going to ask you later, of how you thought that Hey Amarillo had affected your other projects as well. And I think that it kind of was a stepping stone into that, because of the way it, like you said, it built trust with the people in the community and the listeners.
Yeah, I wonder if Brick and Elm would have launched so successfully if the podcast didn't exist. I'm not the only factor in Brick and Elm, of course, and Michelle had a really great reputation. Yeah, but I think it helped a lot. So it's part of the same personal project, which is to tell stories about people who live here.
Absolutely. This final one is from Dean Boyd, who was a guest in January of 2019. What makes you happy? How do you plan to achieve happiness more often? And what have you set out specifically to get there?
See, that's not the kind of question you thought Dean Boyd would ask, right?
Absolutely not.
See, he's full of surprises. I really like this question. And I like Dean Boyd because he's the kind of person who asks these kinds of questions. So what makes you happy? That's a good question for somebody in my position to ask, because I'm in my 50s. Your mom and I are empty nesters. We're in a period of transition. My dad died recently, so I'm thinking a lot about, death and time and finitude of the human experience and all those kinds of things. And so I've been doing a lot of self-reflecting about who I am and how I live and how I approach life. And so this is the right question for me to ask. Now, I don't know if I have a good answer for it. You probably have a better answer what makes me happy, because you can see it and it's not just an internal thing. But I'm happy when I'm outside. I'm happy when I'm out in nature. I'm happy when I'm camping alone deep in the woods of Colorado. I'm happy when I'm moving my body around and I'm going for a walk or a run, or I'm fly fishing or hiking. I'm happy when I'm with my family. But I also, in thinking about that, realize how much I can be in my head and not present during situations when I should probably be happy. And I spend a lot of time in the future worrying about things that haven't happened yet and that may not ever happen, and over which I will have no influence. Like a lot of people who have anxiety or worry or whatever, I'm overinvested in the future and I'm underinvested in what's happening right now. And what's happening right now is the real thing. And what's happening in the future is the imagined thing. That I think we're always in danger of locating the real value of our life, at some point that we might arrive at in the future, and we're never going to reach it. But the real life that we have is the life that's happening right now. And so those are the questions that I'm asking. So those are the things I'm working on. I'm trying to figure out is recognizing what makes me happy and what keeps me from being happy, and then trying to realign my priorities and my approach to life in order to facilitate all that stuff. Part of me trying to get there is letting go of things like this podcast, like ending the podcast. I hope is something that makes me happy. It made me happy to have done it and to be doing it. I enjoy it. But then I started thinking of ending it, and that made me happy. And I thought, oh, I should listen to that. If that makes me excited, then maybe I need to pay attention. And so I'm having to let go of that, of something that I love. I'm letting go of the identity that I have publicly that's tied to that, which that's something I'll probably have to deal with. I have to let go about what people think about me, or how I'm emotionally impacted by things that I can't control. That's hard, and those are all the things that I'm processing all the time. Yeah. But it's the right question to ask, and I probably don't have a real good answer about that.
The last question. Now that this is over and people who followed the podcast still want to follow your creative work, what is next for you?
Project of Hey Amarillo is ending, but the stuff I do with Brick and Elm is the same stuff. It's a different format. So if you like the introduction of interesting people and stories, I would love for you to keep reading Brick and Elm. Subscribe to it. Read it online if you don't subscribe, but we love people to buy like actual physical copies. I love print. I love print magazines and all that kind of stuff. Some people know this already. A lot of people don't, but I've started a paid Substack newsletter about religion called The Religiverse, in which I curate news stories twice a week that have to do with religions all over the world, not just Christianity, not just evangelical Christianity, but Catholicism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Shinto, like all that kind of stuff, because I'm interested in that and because that's my background, is writing about that. And I had the idea that there are a lot of Baptists and they have no idea what's happening in the Catholic world. There are a lot of Catholics that don't know what the Presbyterians are doing. A lot of people in the United States have no idea what's happening in the Muslim world or Hinduism. A lot of people who just finished watching The White Lotus now have questions about Buddhism. I want to be in a position to like talk about and explain all those things because I feel like I'm pretty equipped to do it. I've written my 12 World Religions book, which is my best-selling book I've written, and it's all about that stuff. So I've got a little bit of background in that. So I introduced this several months ago. It's paid. Like you can read maybe one of them before you get to a paywall because it takes me time to curate all this stuff. But if you want to know what I'm thinking and what I'm doing and support some creative work, thereligiverse.substack.com. That's where you can find it. Other than that, like I'm still around. You know, you'll see me at events and doing Brick and Elm stuff and at Palace Coffee, having meetings from time to time. So come say hi. I hope you miss the podcast because I'll miss it. But yeah, time to do something new.
Yeah. Well, that is all the questions that I have for you. And I really appreciate you letting me do this and asking me to do this. Like I said earlier, I was hesitant about it, but I think I really enjoyed learning about your perspective on the podcast since, you know, I've experienced you doing this for the last 7 years and getting to hear kind of that inside info, the background, and like what all the takeaways that you had was really special. So thank you for having me here.
Well, thanks for being on the show. I guess we got about, 5 out of the 6 boyettes who are closest to me on the show at some point. I feel like
that's pretty good.
Pretty good. And that concludes the episode. And it concludes my time on the podcast. So the first thing you should know at this point is that Hey Amarillo itself, as a podcast project and a media brand, isn't ending. Now, I'm not ready to announce anything yet, but I'm having conversations with some local people who are passionate about this area and think a weekly interview show like this needs to continue, even if I'm not involved. So if you're subscribed to Hey Amarillo, stay subscribed, and I'm confident you'll hear more from this podcast in the future. The second thing you should know is that I'm just incredibly thankful for the past 7.5 years. This was always a passion project for me more than a way to generate income. But I do want to talk about my financial supporters because they provided enough ongoing revenue for me to feel okay about the hours I was dedicating to the show every week. Some of that was through advertising, but most of that was because of Patreon and the supporters who pledged $4 a month or $10 or $25 because they liked the project. And so I'm just really, really grateful for these folks. People like Corey Burns and Reagan Hales, Katie Linger, Seth Wick. I mean, they were on board from the very beginning. And there are other people I should thank outside the financial aspect of the show. My very first practice interviews were with Wes Reeves and Jonathan Aaron Baker. They were friends of mine, and I wanted to make sure I could actually do it. If you listen at the very beginning, you heard their episodes. Ginger Nelson was mayor, and she said yes when I pitched interviewing her for a podcast that didn't even exist yet. And then she said yes again when I asked her hard questions in a live show for my 300th episode. And that required a lot of vulnerability from her, and I really do respect it. You should listen to that episode if you haven't. So many people in March and April 2020 agreed to get on the phone with me when I changed my podcast format to do the COVID Chronicles series. None of us knew what was happening, but they were willing to talk to me. And I feel like that's a really good document of what that moment was like here in Amarillo. And as Angelina mentioned, I got to hear some very vulnerable stories from Black residents after the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020. And that was just so humbling and meaningful to me. 3 of my past guests have passed away since recording their episodes. And so it was an honor to get on the record Rachel Edwards, Clay Stribling, and Pat Hickman telling their stories before they died. Many guests have moved away. They don't live here in this area any longer. A couple of them, like Hayden Pedigo or Taylor Moore, they were guests before they hit it big on the national stage. You know, my dad was healthy and living when I started Hey Amarillo, and later this year will mark the 4th year since he died. He listened to the show. You don't think about those things when you think, I should start a local podcast. So it's been a journey. I do want to say thanks again to Angelina for editing every week, for offering suggestions, for making me and my guests sound good. I want to say thanks to my wife, Amy, who has faithfully listened to every episode. So has my mom. They may be the only 2 people who have done that, but I'm grateful for that. I also want to say thanks to KAMR, who has had me as a weekly guest on Studio 4 every Thursday to talk about the show, with people like Megan Collier, Jackie Kingston, when they were there, Andy Justice, Maya Clark, Cheryl Proctor. They would ask me questions about my guests on live TV, with John Harris, a former guest, listening in from the weather desk. That has always been a lot of fun. And the thing I'm most grateful for is for those of you who have listened, and those of you who have let me record your stories for an audience of strangers. There have been times when we've been strangers up until the interview. We didn't know each other, and yet you still let me ask really probing questions about what you do and why you do it here. And I'm humbled by that kind of generosity too. I don't take that lightly. Anyway, I've talked too long. I'm trying to wrap this thing up. The idea is to go out while people still like me and still like the show. So I'm going to end before you're ready for me to end. Thank you for listening. My name is Jason Boyette, and I may see you around in person, but I will not be here next week.